It was a cold, still Thursday. The quiet felt unnatural. Emily, who was always precise and habit-driven, had left her car keys on the kitchen counter, a place she never would have forgotten them. She took great care in keeping everything in its proper spot. Yet, there they were, catching the faint glow of the overhead light, even though she was supposedly spending time with her sister. The thing is, I had spoken to her sister just an hour earlier. Jill had called, casually asking if I had seen Emily, mentioning they hadn't spoken in days. That was the moment a knot of tension tightened in my chest. I brushed it off with a chuckle, pretending it was all a harmless mix-up, but my thoughts were already spiraling. After the call ended, I found myself in the living room, TV playing silently in the background, the sound muted. I held an empty glass, staring blankly at it. On the screen was Emily's favorite show, paused right where we had planned to watch it together that evening. It struck me how ridiculous it was, sitting there, clinging to a paused episode, while my wife's unexplained absence gnawed at me like a question I didn't know how to answer. The silence pressed down, almost unbearable. Then, her phone buzzed. I hadn't noticed it before. It was resting on the armrest of the couch, apparently forgotten in her rush to leave. But Emily never forgot her phone, never. That alone set off alarms in my mind. The screen lit up. A message from someone named Mark. No last name, no emoji, no clue who he was. The preview was short and loaded with implication. Can't stop thinking about earlier. Call me when you can. My chest tightened. I hesitated, unsure why I didn't immediately check the full message. Instead, I stared until the screen faded to black, my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Everything rational inside me urged me to let it go, leave the phone alone, and walk away. But reason had already lost control. Unlocking the phone was effortless. I knew the passcode. It was my birthday. I used to think that was endearing. Now, it felt like a cruel twist. The messages weren't many, but they said more than enough. Mark wasn't just some friendly colleague. From their exchange, it was clear he was someone she met with frequently, someone she opened up to, someone she had clearly been involved with. The messages were painfully revealing. I didn't want to know the details, yet I kept reading. The most painful part wasn't the content of their relationship. It was the tone, the way she talked to him. The jokes, the small stories from her day, the way she used to talk to me. That's what tore me apart. The sound of a car door slamming outside jolted me back to reality. She was back. In a hurry, I locked her phone and placed it exactly where it had been. I stood there, unsure of what I would even say. My heart pounded with a cold mix of anger and deep betrayal. The front door creaked open, and Emily walked in. Her cheeks were flushed, her hair slightly messy. When her eyes met mine, she froze. The keys dangled loosely in her hand. "Why are you still awake?" she asked, her voice light, as if nothing was wrong. But her gaze shifted quickly to the couch where her phone rested. "Just couldn't sleep," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady, though it came out colder than I meant. She gave a tight smile and walked past me into the kitchen, her posture stiff. It was a long evening. "Jill says hi, by the way." I didn't respond. Instead, I watched her carefully, every little movement, every flicker of expression. She was lying, and not very well. Her phone buzzed again, and this time she spun toward it with urgency. Her eyes betrayed her. They flashed with something close to panic. "Who's Mark?" I asked, each word cutting through the air with weight. She froze, her hand still reaching for the phone. Slowly, she turned back to me, her expression unreadable. "Mark?" she repeated, sounding overly casual. "Just someone from work." "Why do you ask?" "Because he says he can't stop thinking about earlier." I let the sentence linger in the air. Her face turned pale. For a second, I thought she might collapse. But then, unexpectedly, she laughed. It wasn't a nervous giggle. It was sharp and bold, almost confrontational. "So you went through my phone?" she snapped, her voice raised. "Seriously, what is wrong with you?" "What's wrong with me?" I retorted, my voice rising above hers now. "You're the one hiding things. Lying about where you were. And exchanging messages like that with someone I've never even heard of." Emily crossed her arms, her expression twisted into a smug smirk that only fueled my anger. "You're being ridiculous," she said. "Mark's a friend. You're blowing this completely out of proportion." I stood there, stunned. She wasn't trying to explain or deny anything. She was dismissing it, mocking me. "Do friends usually talk about what happened earlier?" I asked firmly, locking eyes with her. She rolled her eyes, as if I was being unreasonable. "I don't owe you an explanation," she said, grabbing her phone. "If you're going to be this insecure, maybe we should reconsider this whole marriage." My jaw clenched. I could feel something inside me shift, like a thread snapping. This isn't about insecurity, I said, stepping forward. It's about trust and how you broke it. You owe me that much. For a fleeting moment, I thought I saw a flicker of remorse in her eyes. But it vanished almost instantly, replaced by a cold, detached stare. Fine, she said, her voice chilling. You want the truth? Mark brings a sense of life back into me, something you haven't managed to do in years. Her words struck like a sudden blow, knocking the breath out of me. I staggered slightly, staring at her as though she had turned into a complete stranger, and maybe she had. In a single moment, the carefully built illusion of our life collapsed. All that remained in its place was a cold, unfamiliar emptiness, something I didn't know if I was ready to face. The silence between us felt suffocating, thick enough to drown in. I couldn't move, caught in place as her words echoed again and again in my mind. Mark brings me to life, something you haven't done in years. Emily stood firm, unfazed. In fact, she seemed irritated, as if I was the unreasonable one in this conversation. My heart pounded violently, caught between disbelief and rising anger. I finally managed to speak, my voice low and shaking with emotion. You've really got a lot of nerve, I said, trying to control the fury bubbling under my skin. Feeling alive? Is sneaking around with someone behind my back what that means now? Does that make me some lifeless shell just sitting in the background? She sighed dramatically, crossing her arms with exaggerated annoyance. Please, Liam, drop the act, she said flatly, gesturing between us. Whatever we had, it's been gone for a long time. Stop pretending like you didn't feel it too. Gone. I repeated, my voice rising. Of course I didn't feel it, because I was here, every single day, trying to make things work. Planning vacations, fixing whatever broke, asking about your day, while you were what? Spending your nights wrapped up with Mark. Her mouth twitched slightly, and for a fleeting second, I thought there might be a trace of regret. But then she let out a small, dismissive laugh. You're acting like I ran off to another state or something. It's not that dramatic. Mark and I, we just connect. There's something genuine between us, something I don't feel with you anymore. It wasn't just her words, but the way she said them, calm, unbothered, almost bored, that ignited a deeper fury in me. Genuine? I shouted. You call sneaking around and lying genuine? Real love is staying when things get hard. It's choosing to work through the mess instead of jumping into someone else's arms because it's easier. Emily's expression changed. For a moment, she recoiled from my tone, but then she quickly straightened, her face hardening again. You have no idea what this has been like, she snapped. I've been so unhappy, Liam. For years. And you didn't even notice. You just went through the motions, work, home, the same routine. I felt invisible. She jabbed her finger toward me as she continued. Mark noticed me. He listened. He made me feel like I mattered. Each word landed like a dagger. Her voice was filled with frustration, but beneath it, I sensed something else, a hint of fear. She wasn't just trying to justify what she had done. She was trying to make herself believe in it too. And what about me? I asked, my voice quieter now, though still burning with emotion. Do you really think I didn't feel you pulling away? That I didn't see how you stopped looking at me the same way? I felt just as invisible, Emily. But I didn't turn my back on us. I didn't betray you. For a split second, her tough exterior faltered. Her eyes softened just a bit, and her lips parted as if she might say something honest. But then, just as quickly, she turned away, her expression shuddered once more. You're impossible, she muttered, brushing past me toward the staircase. Don't you dare walk away from me, I said, following close behind. She spun around abruptly, fire flashing in her eyes. What do you want from me, Liam? An apology? You want me to say I regret it? She threw her arms up in frustration. Fine. I'm sorry. Is that what you want to hear? Does that make you feel better? Her words dripped with sarcasm. It wasn't an apology, not really. It was just noise, a hollow gesture that only made my blood boil all over again. No, I answered, my voice tight with restrained rage. I'm not better. Because this isn't something you just say sorry for and move on. You destroyed something important, Emily. Something that can't be put back together. Her face stiffened, and she said nothing in return. Instead, she turned and walked up the stairs, leaving me standing there, frozen in place, overwhelmed by the surge of emotions clawing at my chest. As I watched her disappear from view, an intense wave of helplessness washed over me. The woman I thought I knew, the life I believed we built, was slipping through my hands like sand I couldn't hold on to. But beneath the rage, something more dangerous began to stir, a dark, unrelenting thought. If she believed she could end everything like this, if she thought she could simply walk away without consequences, she was deeply mistaken. I wasn't going to let her decide how the story ended. The house was uncomfortably still the following morning. Emily barely acknowledged me, her focus locked onto her coffee mug as if it held some secret wisdom. I didn't try to make conversation. My mind was too consumed by everything that had happened. She had broken something sacred between us, and instead of showing any sign of remorse, she carried herself like none of it mattered. That cold detachment only added fuel to the fire burning inside me. If she thought she could brush it all off and move on like nothing happened, she was in for a surprise. As soon as she stepped out, presumably heading to work, though I wasn't entirely convinced she actually was, I set my own plan into motion. The first task was simple: locate Mark. That part didn't take long. His name still appeared in her message history, and after countless restless nights, I'd memorized his phone number. A quick online reverse search gave me the basics: Mark Hampton, in his mid-30s, employed in sales for some nondescript corporate entity. He was the epitome of ordinary, average appearance, unremarkable build, the kind of person you wouldn't glance at twice in a crowd. Yet somehow, he had managed to insert himself into Emily's life, and by extension, mine. The real challenge was deciding how to act on what I'd learned. I wasn't the type to make impulsive, rash decisions. I wasn't going to storm into his office and start a scene. No, I wanted to do something with more impact, something that would linger. I took a sick day and poured my time into learning more about Mark. His social media presence was surprisingly open and, as it turned out, extremely helpful. That's when I found her Valerie, his girlfriend. A petite brunette with lively eyes and a warm, inviting smile. Their photos told the story of a happy couple: sweet getaways, cheerful dinners, anniversary snapshots. They looked picture-perfect. I wondered how much she knew, if anything. So I sent her a message. It wasn't aggressive or cruel. Just a calm, anonymous note designed to open her eyes without tearing her apart. I wrote, "Hi, Valerie. I think it's important you know that your boyfriend, Mark, has been seeing my wife, Emily. I hate to be the one to tell you, but I figured you should hear it from someone who understands what this feels like." I attached selected screenshots of their messages, clear, irrefutable evidence. Then I hit send. The rush of sending that message surged through me, a mix of nervousness and grim satisfaction. Still, it wasn't enough. Not yet. By the time Emily returned home that evening, I had masked the chaos inside me with an unsettling calm. She breezed in as though it were just another day, dropped her purse on the counter, and casually flipped through the day's mail. "How was work?" I asked, keeping my tone light, almost friendly. She glanced at me with a flicker of suspicion. "It was fine," she said curtly. I added, "And Mark? Is he doing all right?" Her hand froze mid-motion for the briefest moment, betraying her surprise, before she quickly composed herself. "What are you talking about?" she asked, feigning confusion. I leaned back slightly, not pushing too hard. "Just thought you might have checked in on him after how close you two seemed last night." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't offer a reply. Instead, she reached for a bottle of wine and poured herself a large glass. I let the quiet hang between us, watching, waiting for her to break. She didn't. Then my phone buzzed on the table. "Who's that?" she asked sharply, eyeing the screen. I gave a half-smile. "Funny. I was going to ask you that same question yesterday." Her eyes narrowed. She didn't pursue it, but I could see the gears turning behind her expression. She was trying to assess how much I knew. Truthfully, I knew more than enough. Enough to dismantle the fantasy she had built with Mark. Enough to ensure that neither of them would walk away from this unshaken. The message was from Valerie. She'd written, "Thank you for telling me. I had no idea. Can we talk? I need to understand everything." I slipped the phone back into my pocket, feeling a brief flicker of validation. The first move had been made. I couldn't see the final outcome yet, but one thing was clear: there would be consequences. "Let's have dinner," I said suddenly, breaking the heavy silence. Emily blinked. "What?" "A nice dinner," I repeated, watching her closely. "Just the two of us. Maybe we can talk about what comes next." She looked at me as though trying to figure out if she was walking into a trap. And she wasn't wrong. "Fine," she said after a pause, her voice tinged with hesitation. I smiled, but it was only surface deep. The following day, I had a meeting with Valerie planned. And after that, Emily and I would be having a conversation of a very different nature. The next afternoon, I met Valerie at a quiet little coffee shop in the heart of downtown. It was her suggestion, a place that was neutral, discreet, and well away from familiar faces. I arrived early, selecting a seat by the window so I could keep an eye on the street. When she arrived, I recognized her immediately from her online photos. She was small, composed, and put together, though her eyes gave away the turmoil beneath her calm exterior. She scanned the room, then walked toward me with hesitant steps. "Liam," she asked gently. I stood to greet her. "Yeah, that's me." We nodded politely, an awkward formality considering what had brought us together. She sat across from me, carefully setting her phone on the table while gripping her cup of tea as if anchoring herself with it. We sat in silence for a few beats, strangers joined by shared betrayal. "Thank you for meeting me," Valerie finally said, breaking the quiet. "I wish it didn't have to be like this," I responded sincerely. She nodded, her eyes drifting down to the table. "I keep hoping this is all some misunderstanding," she confessed. "But the screenshots, they're real, aren't they?" I didn't dance around the truth. "Yes, they're real." Valerie flinched, as if the truth had struck her physically. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself before asking, "How long has this been going on?" I paused, unsure. "I only found out last night. But based on the messages I saw, it's been happening for quite some time." She shut her eyes, absorbing the impact of what I'd said. When she opened them again, there was still sadness, but now it was edged with resolve. "Mark's been distant lately," she admitted. "I thought maybe it was just pressure from work, or life in general. But now it all adds up." I nodded, my voice laced with resentment. "I know that feeling all too well." For nearly half an hour, we exchanged observations, patterns of behavior, excuses that once seemed harmless but now were glaring red flags. Valerie's voice trembled as she described the late-night phone calls Mark had taken, always brushing them off as work-related emergencies. I opened up about Emily's fabrications, how she'd used her sister as an alibi and made me doubt my own instincts. By the time our conversation wound down, the sorrow in Valerie's tone had shifted into a steely resolve. "I won't let him get away with this," she said with quiet determination. "Neither will I agreed. She leaned back. I was thoughtful. "So, what's your next move?" "I'm not sure yet," I confessed. "But what I do know is this, it won't remain a secret." A faint, bitter smile appeared on her lips. "Good. People like them thrive in silence." Before parting, we exchanged phone numbers and promised to stay in touch. As Valerie walked away, I couldn't help but admire the quiet strength in her stride. She had been deeply hurt, but she wasn't shattered. And neither was I. When I got back home, my thoughts were spinning. Emily still wasn't back, giving me the space I needed to process everything and start planning. When she finally walked through the door, her face gave away nothing. She offered a silent nod and made her way to the kitchen to pour herself another glass of wine. "Dinner's nearly ready," I said, keeping my voice even. She glanced at me, suspicion flickering in her eyes, but said nothing. We ate in tense silence, exchanging only polite, meaningless small talk. The real conversation, the one we both knew was coming, hung in the air like a storm cloud. As we finished, I set my fork down and looked directly at her. "I saw Valerie today," I mentioned casually. Emily froze, her wineglass halted midway to her lips. "Who?" she asked, trying to sound clueless. "Mark's girlfriend," I clarified. "Charming woman. Completely unaware of what you two have been doing behind her back. Funny how lies have a way of unraveling when you least expect it." Her face went pale, though she quickly pulled herself together. "What do you think you're doing, Liam?" she demanded. "Cleaning up the mess you made," I replied firmly. "You had no right," she hissed, her voice low but cutting. "No right?" My voice rose. "You're the one who tore this marriage apart, Emily. Don't talk to me about rights." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "You're pathetic," she snapped. "Dragging other people into this? What exactly do you think that's going to accomplish?" "I'm making sure that neither you nor Mark walks away from this without consequences," I answered coolly. "You wanted connections, well, now you've got them. With Mark, with me, with Valerie. We're all tangled in the web you spun." Her eyes narrowed, emotions flickering between rage and fear. "You're insane," she said. "Maybe," I admitted, standing to meet her glare. "But at least I can still face myself in the mirror." She opened her mouth as if to say something, but then thought better of it. Without another word, she stormed upstairs, leaving me alone at the table. I didn't follow. There was no need. The damage was done, and things were already in motion. The following morning, the real storm began. Emily was gone when I woke up, no doubt running off to wherever she thought Mark could shield her from the consequences. But I wasn't concerned with her anymore. My focus had shifted to what came next. By mid-morning, a message from Valerie appeared on my phone. "Mark came home late last night." I confronted him. He denied it at first, but when I showed him the messages, he panicked. He confessed everything. Claimed it wasn't serious. Said he felt trapped. He's staying with a friend now. I'm done. Reading her words hit me harder than I'd anticipated. I didn't feel sorry for Mark, but I could sense the raw pain in Valerie's message. She had lost just as much as I had, perhaps even more. I responded simply, I'm sorry you're dealing with this. Let me know if you need anything. Her reply came swiftly. You've already done more than enough. Thank you for being honest. With Mark effectively removed from the equation, I redirected my attention back to Emily. If she believed she could bury what she'd done or carry on as if nothing had changed, she was sorely mistaken. That evening, she arrived home late again. The scent of wine clung to her, mixed with a faint floral perfume, an unmistakable sign that she had spent her day drowning in alcohol in the company of someone else. She didn't so much as glance my way as she walked in, her gaze fixed ahead. I waited until she reached the staircase before calling out, So, running back to Mark didn't quite go the way you hoped, did it? She came to a halt, her fingers tightening around the railing. Slowly, she turned to face me. What exactly are you saying? You seriously believe Valerie warned him to stay away from you? I asked, keeping my tone steady, though my words carried a sharp edge. She's not nearly as naive as you assumed. Emily's jaw tensed, and the cracks in her composure began to show. You're unbelievable, she muttered, beginning her descent down the stairs with measured, deliberate steps. Dragging her into this? That's unbelievably cruel. Cruel, I echoed, rising to confront her. Let's talk about what cruelty really looks like, Emily. Try lying straight to someone's face, pretending there's still hope, all while sneaking around with someone else. How's that for cruel? You wouldn't get it, she fired back, her voice quivering with emotion. Then help me understand, I challenged, moving closer. Because right now, all I see is someone who didn't have the courage to end things properly before falling into someone else's arms. She recoiled slightly, her gaze flickering away. For a brief second, it seemed she might finally come clean, confess to the chaos she had caused. But instead, she stood tall and stared me down. You've always acted like you were morally superior, she said bitterly. Like you were some flawless husband who never did anything wrong. But you can't even see yourself clearly, Liam. You've been distant for years, completely absorbed in your own world. If you want to blame me, fine. Hate me all you want. But don't pretend like you're faultless in all this. Her words were meant to cut deep, and they did. Still, beneath her rage, I saw something else, something raw and desperate she couldn't completely conceal. I never said I was perfect, I said quietly. But I was faithful. I loved you, Emily. And you threw that away like it meant nothing. She turned away, pacing the room like a restless animal. You don't understand, she said, her voice cracking under the weight of her emotions. I felt stuck, like I couldn't breathe. Mark wasn't supposed to happen. But he reminded me of the person I used to be. The person you used to be? I repeated, stunned. You mean the one who lies, cheats, and breaks the hearts of people who truly care about her? She stopped moving, her shoulders drooping under invisible weight. For the first time, she looked fragile, small even. But then, just as quickly, her expression hardened. I don't owe you an explanation, she said coldly. Then don't give one, I replied, stepping back. I've heard more than enough already. I snatched my keys and stormed out, slamming the door behind me. The night air was crisp, hitting me like a slap across the face, but it wasn't enough to quiet the storm in my head. I drove around without any destination, letting the memories and arguments replay over and over. Eventually, I made my way back home, only to find that Emily had vanished. I had no clue where she'd gone, and for the first time, I didn't feel like finding out. The following morning, her belongings were still there, but she wasn't. And in that silence, something inside me shifted. This didn't feel like the end. Not yet. 2 days slipped by. Emily never came back. I didn't bother calling or messaging her. She'd made her decision, and I was done pursuing her. But the quiet didn't offer any peace, it only brought more questions. Where had she gone? Who was she with? Was she still clinging to Mark? Or had that illusion shattered too? On the morning of the third day, my phone vibrated. It wasn't Emily, it was Valerie. Mark keeps calling nonstop. Says he wants to explain himself. I blocked him. Just thought you should know. I stared at her message, feeling a strange cocktail of relief and bitterness. Mark's perfect world was falling apart. And though part of me felt some grim satisfaction, another part wondered if Emily's world was collapsing right along with his. Later that day, I found out. I was halfway through eating a bland, cold sandwich when I heard the front door creak open. Emily stepped inside. Her face looked pale and hollow, the usual sharpness in her features dulled by exhaustion. She didn't say a word. Instead, she set her bag down and sank into the couch. I eyes locked on the floor. So, you decided to show up, I said, the tension in my voice impossible to hide. She didn't reply. You want to tell me where you've been? I asked, pushing my plate aside. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet mine. There was no anger left in them, no spark, just a dull, worn-out acceptance. I've been staying with a friend, she said, her voice soft. Mark? I asked sharply. She shook her head. No, not Mark. Good, I said, leaning back. Because he's got enough problems cleaning up his own disaster. Valerie blocked him, by the way. Thought you'd find that interesting. Emily flinched, but stayed silent. Why are you here, Emily? I asked after a pause. Her fingers nervously twisted in her lap. I needed to pick up some things, she said, barely audible. That all? I asked, frustration bubbling up. She hesitated, then gave a small nod. But her posture told another story. If you've got something to say, then say it, I said firmly, arms crossed. Otherwise, just leave. I don't have the patience for more of your games. She recoiled at my tone, her shoulders slumping. For a second, I thought she was about to cry. But instead, she pulled herself together, looked straight into my eyes, and said with a trembling voice, I don't know what I'm doing. I had convinced myself that Mark was the missing piece in my life, the answer to everything I'd been searching for. But looking around now, all I saw was chaos. I couldn't even begin to figure out how to fix the wreckage. Her voice, full of defeat despite her usual boldness, hit me hard. She wasn't holding it together anymore. There's no fixing this, Emily, I said, my tone gentler than before, though still unwavering. You made your decisions. You can't just wish them away because they didn't turn out the way you hoped. She gave a small nod, a single tear trailing down her cheek. That moment should have awakened something in me, some leftover affection, the instinct to protect her. But instead, I felt nothing. You wanted to feel something again, I said, standing up and taking a step closer. Well, you got what you wanted. You tore everything apart for it. So tell me, was it worth it? She remained silent. Was it worth it, Emily? I asked again, louder this time. Her voice cracked as she finally responded, her face buried in her hands. No. Her confession should have felt like a win, an acknowledgement of everything she'd destroyed. But instead, it felt hollow. Like everything else, it had come too late to matter. You can stay tonight, I said, my tone stripped of emotion. But tomorrow, you need to make a choice. Because I can't keep living like this. She nodded once more, wiping her eyes. Thank you, she murmured. I didn't reply. I just turned away and headed upstairs, leaving her alone with the consequences she had created. That night, I lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling. Her presence in the house felt ghostly, a lingering reminder of everything we'd lost. And as much as I tried to convince myself that there might still be something to fight for, the truth was becoming clearer with every moment that passed. This wasn't just the beginning of the storm. The storm had already arrived. By the next morning, the sound of dishes clinking faintly in the kitchen stirred me from a restless sleep. For a brief second, I hoped I had only imagined everything. That Emily hadn't torn our world apart. That the betrayal had just been a dream. But reality hit the moment I stepped into the hallway. There she was, still in yesterday's clothes, standing by the kitchen counter, slowly stirring her coffee like her mind was somewhere else entirely. She looked like she hadn't slept at all. Good morning, I said coolly. She flinched at the sound of my voice, but didn't lift her gaze. Morning, she mumbled back. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I poured myself a cup of coffee, keeping her in my peripheral vision. It wasn't just exhaustion that I saw. She was falling apart. So, I said eventually, cutting through the tension, have you figured anything out yet? Finally, she looked up at me. Her eyes were red, her face pale. Figured what out? What you want, I clarified, leaning against the counter. Because this limbo you're in, it's not going to work anymore. She let out a weary sigh and gently placed her mug down. I don't know, Liam, she said, her voice barely steady. Everything feels so tangled. Tangled, I repeated sharply. You're the one who tangled it all, Emily. You lied. You were unfaithful. You set fire to everything we built. And now you want to stand here and pretend like cleaning up the aftermath is just too much. My words clearly hit her, but I didn't back down. Do you even understand what you did? I continued, my voice rising. Do you have any idea what it's like to find out that the person you trusted the most just tossed you aside? And for what? For something meaningless? Tears welled up in her eyes, but I didn't feel a shred of pity. Not anymore. I felt like I was drowning, she said quietly, her voice shaking. I didn't know how to breathe anymore. Mark wasn't supposed to mean anything. He was just an escape. An escape, I repeated, disgusted. You could have come to me. You could have told me what you were going through. Instead, you went to someone else and lied to my face. Her gaze dropped as tears streamed down her cheeks. I know I hurt you, she whispered. I never meant for it to go this far. Stop pretending you didn't know what you were doing, I snapped. Every time you lied, every time you snuck around, you made a choice. Don't act like you were some helpless bystander in your own story. For a while, neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt crushing. I'm not asking you to forgive me, she said at last, her voice barely a whisper. But I still care about you, Liam. I don't want to lose you. Her words should have reached me, but they didn't. Caring wasn't enough. Not anymore. I honestly don't know if there's anything left to fight for, I said flatly. Her expression crumbled as she turned away, her shoulders trembling with quiet sobs. I looked away, unable to bear the sight. A small part of me still wanted to comfort her, to tell her we'd find a way. But the pain ran too deep. As I stood by the window, watching the gray sky outside, my phone buzzed on the counter. I glanced down to see a message from Valerie. Mark's trying to come back. He showed up at my place last night, begging for forgiveness. I told him it was done, but he's not taking it well. Be careful. Emily might do the same. I stared at the screen, my stomach twisting. Was that what all of this had been about? Was this her desperate attempt to salvage the life she had already destroyed? Behind me, Emily's sobs had quieted, replaced by the subtle sounds of her footsteps moving toward the front door. When I turned, I saw her grabbing her bag, her face red and streaked with tears. Where do you think you're going? My words came out harsher than I had intended. Her reply was barely above a whisper, her throat clearly raw. Out. To see Mark. I pressed, unable to hide the sharpness in my voice. She stopped abruptly, one hand on the doorknob. For a few tense seconds, she remained silent, then turned to face me. Her expression was unreadable. No, she said finally. Not to Mark. Without another word, she stepped outside, the door slamming shut behind her with a jarring echo that lingered in the stillness. I stood motionless, staring at the empty space she had left. Though the storm outside hadn't passed, something was becoming more certain. If Emily thought she could start over by rebuilding on the ruins of my world, she was deeply mistaken. This had grown beyond betrayal. Now, it was about what lay ahead. The house felt unnervingly silent after she left. It wasn't a peaceful kind of quiet. It was the tense stillness that arrives before a storm hits, the kind that weighs heavily on your chest and keeps your nerves on edge. This time, I didn't follow her. I didn't feel the need to. Wherever she had gone, she would either find what she was looking for or spiral even further. But the quiet didn't last long. By mid-afternoon, my phone buzzed. A message from Valerie lit up the screen. Mark won't stop. He's trying to tell me it was just a big misunderstanding, swearing he's a changed man. He even hinted that Emily regrets everything. Have you heard anything from her? As I stared at the screen, frustration surged in me. So Mark and Emily were trying to clean up the mess now? It was far too late for that. I typed back, Emily showed up last night. She's a mess. I have no clue what she's planning, but I don't trust it. Valerie's reply came almost instantly. Watch your back, Liam. Mark's a manipulator. And if Emily's still tied to him in any way, they might be planning to flip this whole thing on you. Be smart. Her words hit me like a sudden blow. Could they still be scheming? Or was this just the natural paranoia that betrayal leaves behind? Regardless, I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me. The answer came sooner than expected. Around 7 in the evening, Emily burst back through the front door, slamming it shut so hard it rattled the windows. Her cheeks were flushed, her jaw tight with tension. Where have you been? I asked, standing up as she marched into the living room. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she flung her bag onto the couch and crossed her arms tightly, glaring at me as though I had wronged her. Why are you talking to Valerie? She demanded. Her accusation landed like a punch. I opened my mouth to respond but stumbled over my words. She took a step toward me, her eyes blazing. Don't try to deny it. I know you've been in touch with her. She told me. Regaining my composure, I said firmly, I've been talking to Valerie because she has every right to know what's going on. Unlike you, I have nothing to hide. Emily's expression twisted with frustration. You really are unbelievable, Liam. Pulling other people into this like it's some drama show. Do you know how pathetic that makes you look? Pathetic? I repeated with disbelief, stepping closer. You cheated. You lied for months. And now I'm the pathetic one? You could have kept this between us, but you chose not to. She shot back quickly. You made it public when you dragged Valerie into it. You're just making everything worse. So now you're worried about consequences? I snapped. You weren't exactly concerned about hurting Valerie or me while sneaking around with Mark. What's changed? Is it that Mark's fantasy life is collapsing and now you're scrambling? Her face burned with anger, and for a second, I thought she might lash out. Instead, she let out a hollow laugh that sent a chill through me. Mark's out of the picture, she said bitterly. He's done. I'm finished with him. I stared at her, struggling to process what she had just said. What are you talking about? I made a mistake, she admitted, her voice lower now. Getting involved with him was a mistake. I realized that. For a fleeting moment, a small part of me dared to feel hope. Maybe she truly regretted it. Maybe there was still something left to rebuild. But that fragile hope vanished the moment she continued. But don't pretend you were perfect, Liam. You were cold. Distant. Half the time, it felt like I didn't even exist. Mark wasn't the root of our problems. We were. My jaw clenched. You can't be serious, I said, my voice trembling with anger. You're actually trying to blame this on me? I'm not blaming anyone, she replied, her tone now defensive. I'm saying we were both lost. You checked out long before I did. Don't twist this, I growled, pointing directly at her. I never checked out. I didn't lie. I didn't betray you. That was your decision. You're the one who tore this apart. Her eyes welled with tears, but she held her ground. I was in pain, Liam, and you didn't care. You didn't even see it. How could I see anything? I yelled. You pushed me away. You lied straight to my face. And then you went to Mark, looking for comfort. How could I fix something when you'd already left? The silence in the room was thick, pressing down on us after everything we'd said. Emily's eyes met mine, filled with a storm of emotions, anger, guilt, and something more elusive I couldn't quite name. Her voice, barely audible, finally broke the quiet. I don't even understand how we ended up like this. I exhaled sharply, my chest rising and falling with frustration. This is where we are because you weren't honest with me. You made the decision that I wasn't enough, without even giving me a chance to show you otherwise. She didn't answer. Without a word, she turned and walked out, leaving me behind, my fists clenched and heart pounding in my chest. That was the moment it truly hit me. No matter how badly I needed closure, answers, or even a simple apology, those things might never come. Emily wasn't ready to accept the reality, not about Mark, not about our relationship, and definitely not about herself. And as painful as that realization was, I knew I couldn't keep standing still, waiting for her to catch up. By the next morning, she had vanished again. Her bag was gone, her car no longer in the driveway, and even her lingering scent had disappeared before I opened my eyes. For once, I didn't feel the urge to chase after her, or to care where she had gone or who she might be with. The house felt different, lighter, in a strange way. But that lightness wasn't comfort. It was emptiness. Every room seemed to mock me with reminders of a life that felt more like a staged performance than something genuine. The framed photos on the mantel, the unfinished novel left on the nightstand, even the throw blanket tossed on the couch, all of it was soaked in her presence. I had thought I'd already reached the lowest point. I was wrong. Around mid-morning, my phone buzzed. It wasn't Valerie this time, nor some random app notification. It was Emily. We need to talk. Can you meet me at the park at 2? The sheer nerve behind that message made me almost laugh out loud. After everything, she still thought she could decide how and when these conversations happened. Yet curiosity, or maybe something deeper and darker, got the better of me. I needed to see what she had to say, even if it was just more excuses or another shallow apology. At 5 minutes before 2, I pulled into a parking space on the edge of the park. The sky was overcast, clouds heavy and gray, mirroring my mood. Emily was already seated on a bench beside the duck pond, hands folded in her lap. She looked small, almost delicate, but I knew better than to let appearances fool me. I approached slowly, my footsteps crunching against the gravel. As I neared, she looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes tired. "Liam," she said softly, almost as if afraid to speak my name aloud. I didn't answer. I folded my arms and stayed a few feet away, waiting for her to say more. She hesitated, nervously twisting her fingers. "Thank you for coming," she managed, her voice shaky. "Just say what you came to say," I replied sharply. She recoiled slightly but gave a small nod. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," she began, her gaze flitting between me and the pond. "About what happened, about us. I know I hurt you, and saying I'm sorry doesn't make it right. But I mean it. The words floated in the air, uncertain and heavy. For a split second, I almost believed her. But then she kept going. I didn't plan for this. I was just lost. And Mark, he was there when I needed someone. He made me feel. Don't finish that, I cut in, my voice steady but cold. Don't say he made you feel alive again. I've heard that before, and I'm not going to listen to it again. Tears began to gather in her eyes as she looked down. It's not just about him, she whispered. It's about everything between us. We've been drifting apart for a long time. You keep using the word, we, I said, frustration rising. But I wasn't the one sneaking around. I wasn't the one lying. This was your choice, Emily. You broke us, not both of us. Just you. Her shoulders trembled as quiet sobs shook her, but I felt no pity. I couldn't. I don't know how to make this right, she admitted through her tears. You can't, I replied firmly. Some things don't get fixed. She looked up at me, her eyes wide with desperation. Please, Liam, don't say that. We could try again. We could see someone, go to therapy, take small steps. I shook my head, my tone final. No, I'm not going to keep patching something you set on fire. You made a decision. You picked him. And now, after all that, you expect me to just pretend none of it happened? Life doesn't work that way. She reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, her hand feeling like a stranger's. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, she said, her voice cracking. But I'm asking for it anyway. Please. My chest tightened, but I didn't waver. You're not looking for forgiveness, I said. You're looking for a way to ease your own guilt. But that's not something I can give you. Her sobs grew louder, drawing the attention of people walking by. I didn't care. You said you wanted to talk, I said coldly. You've said what you needed to. This is the end of it. Liam, wait, she called after me as I turned and walked away. I didn't look back. As I made my way to the car, the burden I'd carried for so long began to lift, if only slightly. I wasn't free yet, not completely. But for the first time, it felt like I was finally heading towards something better. Emily may have destroyed the life we built together, but I wouldn't let her destroy me too. The drive home from the park felt strangely unreal. My fingers clenched the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned pale as the memory of Emily's tearful voice echoed in my mind. She appeared devastated, completely broken, but that wasn't enough to bring about the kind of forgiveness she seemed to be hoping for. It wasn't that I was unwilling to release my anger, it was that I simply didn't know how to. Not yet. When I arrived home, the familiar emptiness of the house wrapped around me like a worn-out coat. The quiet, once unsettling, had now become strangely comforting over the past several days. But as I dropped onto the couch and fixated on the blank screen of the television, a persistent thought took hold. This wasn't finished. Emily wasn't going to walk away without trying again. That suspicion was confirmed an hour later when the doorbell rang. I hadn't been expecting anyone, and for a brief second, I debated whether to even answer. But curiosity got the better of me. I stood and opened the door. There she was, Emily, standing on the front step with a suitcase at her side. Her eyes were puffy and red, her lips trembling as she looked at me. What are you doing here? My words came out sharper than I'd intended. I didn't know where else to go, she murmured, her voice cracking. You can't stay here, I said firmly, stepping forward to block her path. Liam, I'm begging you, she pleaded. Just one night. I have nowhere else to go. I won't be a burden. I promise. I glanced at her, then at the suitcase resting by her feet. The desperation in her expression was undeniable. For a fleeting moment, the idea of closing the door on her entered my mind. But instead, I let out a heavy sigh and stepped aside. One night, I said coldly. And then you leave. Thank you, she whispered, dragging the suitcase across the threshold. She settled into the guest bedroom, the one barely touched, which now felt like the only logical place for her to stay. I didn't say much. There was nothing I wanted to talk about. I went back to the living room and turned on the television, trying to lose myself in meaningless noise. But the silence between us lingered, loud and unavoidable. Eventually, she appeared again, standing hesitantly in the doorway. Can we talk? She asked in a quiet voice. We've talked enough, I responded, eyes glued to the screen. Please, Liam, she insisted, voice soft but insistent. With a sigh, I turned off the television and looked at her, my patience wearing dangerously thin. What is it you want now, Emily? She twisted her hands nervously. I just need to explain. You deserve to know everything. My eyebrow lifted in skepticism. There's more I don't know? Her expression faltered. Guilt swept across her face. Mark wasn't the first, she confessed. The revelation hit like a punch to the chest. I sat still, unable to speak. There was someone else, she continued, voice shaking. It was a long time ago, before Mark. It didn't last, but it happened. A wave of anger and betrayal surged through me, my heart pounding in disbelief. And you're just telling me this now? I asked, my voice trembling. I thought I could bury it, she said through sobs, tears streaming freely. I thought if I pretended it never happened, we could move forward. But I was wrong. I've been wrong about so many things. I rose to my feet, looming over her, anger pulsing through every fiber of my body. Do you even understand what you've done? I asked, my tone dangerously low. You didn't just break our marriage, you broke me. Every time I trusted you, every time I believed in what we had, you were lying. Emily crumpled under the weight of her guilt, sobbing uncontrollably as she covered her face. I know I hurt you, she managed to say between sobs. I never expected forgiveness. I just needed to be honest before it was too late. Too late. I repeated bitterly, a humorless laugh escaping me. Emily, it's already far too late. She collapsed to the floor, her cries reverberating through the room. For the briefest moment, a flicker of sympathy crossed my mind. But the overwhelming sense of finality smothered it almost immediately. I'll never be able to trust you again, I said, my voice clear and steady. And without trust, there's nothing left for us. This marriage ended a long time ago, Emily. Her gaze lifted to meet mine, hollow and full of sorrow. I don't know who I am without you, she whispered. You should have thought about that before, I replied, my tone cold. Now, you'll have to figure that out on your own. Turning away, I walked upstairs, leaving her sobs behind me. For the first time in what felt like ages, my mind felt unclouded. Emily had already dismantled the life we built together, piece by piece. But I refused to let her drag me down any further. The next morning, I would help her pack. And then, I'd say goodbye this time, for good. That night, sleep barely came. Though the house was quiet, my mind was far from it. Emily remained in the guest room downstairs, and for once, the physical space between us mirrored the emotional gulf that had formed long ago. I got out of bed early, resolved to bring this chapter to an end. I couldn't afford to let it linger. She needed to leave, and I needed to begin rebuilding my life, one step at a time. By the time I walked downstairs, she was already at the kitchen table, a mug of coffee cradled in her hands. She looked like a shadow of the woman I once knew, eyes vacant, her hair in disarray, sadness deeply etched across her face. Good morning, I said, my tone devoid of emotion. She looked up, parting her lips as if to speak, but no words came out. I'll help you pack after breakfast, I added, continuing past her. As I walked over to the counter to pour myself a cup of coffee, I heard her voice, soft, barely audible. Liam, she murmured. I didn't turn around. What is it? I know I can't undo any of this, she replied, her words shaky, filled with regret. But I need you to know. I'm sorry. For everything. I finally turned to face her, my eyes fixed and cold. Saying sorry doesn't erase the damage, I told her. It won't erase the lies, the betrayal, or the hurt you caused. She winced at my words, but kept her gaze on me. I understand, she whispered, eyes glassy with unshed tears. I just needed to be honest. At last. I exhaled slowly and set my mug down. Honest. I echoed with bitterness. Don't you think it's far too late for that now? The tears began to spill down her cheeks, but I kept my stance. I couldn't allow myself to soften, not now. I've already lost everything, Liam. Her voice cracked as she spoke. You, Mark. I don't even recognize who I am anymore. You lost me the moment you chose to believe I wasn't enough, I replied, my voice steady and unwavering. As for Mark, he never mattered. You gave up your entire life for someone who cared as little for you as you did for me. She covered her face with trembling hands, crying silently as her shoulders shook. For a fleeting moment, something stirred in me, sympathy, maybe, but it passed quickly. Finish your coffee, I said sharply, turning away. We've got things to do. By the time the sun had climbed higher into the sky, the guest room was cluttered with boxes. Emily packed quietly, her movements slow and purposeful. I kept to myself, offering neither assistance nor conversation. When the final item was packed, she stood in the doorway with her suitcase at her side. I don't have anywhere to go, she admitted softly. That's not my responsibility, I answered without emotion. She didn't argue. Her eyes filled with tears once more, but she simply nodded, grabbed the suitcase handle, and began dragging it toward the front door. I followed at a distance, my chest tightening as I watched her struggle with not just the weight of her belongings, but with the heaviness of everything else. When she reached the entrance, she turned around slowly, facing me one last time. Liam, her voice wavered. What? I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. Do you think things will ever be okay between us? I studied her face for a long moment, words forming but refusing to leave my mouth. At last, I shook my head. No, we won't be. She nodded, letting her tears fall freely now. I'm so sorry, she whispered. I didn't reply. She opened the door and stepped into the brisk morning air. For a moment, she looked back, as if on the verge of saying something more. But she sighed instead and walked away, the sound of the suitcase wheels echoing against the pavement as she disappeared. I stood there, unmoving, watching her until she vanished from view. When I finally shut the door behind me, the atmosphere inside felt altered. There was still emptiness, but it carried a sense of relief. Emily was gone, and along with her, the burden of her deception. For the first time in many weeks, I could breathe again. The days that followed were hazy. The silence inside the house was no longer suffocating. It had become peaceful, full of potential. I dove into small projects, clearing out the guest room, rearranging the living room, even applying fresh paint to the kitchen walls. These weren't just distractions, they were ways to reclaim my environment, to make it my own again. Even though she was gone, reminders of Emily remained. A scarf left behind in the hallway. Scribbled notes in the margin of a worn-out recipe book. Each item struck me like a sudden bruise, but I didn't shy away. Instead, I faced each one and carefully packed them, saving them for her in case she ever returned to collect the remnants of her past. Valerie and I exchanged occasional messages. They weren't long, but they were enough. How are you doing? She texted one evening. Better. I typed back. It's strange, but it feels like I can finally breathe. You. I added. Same, she responded. Mark keeps trying to get in touch, but I've blocked him everywhere. It feels good to take back control. Her words hit me deeply. That's what all of this had been about, control. Emily's betrayal had robbed me of trust, love, and security, but I didn't have to let it steal what came next. A week after she had left, my phone rang. Emily's name appeared on the screen. I almost ignored it, but instinctively, I answered. What is it? I asked firmly. There was a silence on the other end before she finally spoke. I just wanted to say thank you. I raised my eyebrows, thrown off. For what? For letting me go, she said quietly. For not making everything even harder than it already was. I'm not sure what I'm doing right now, but I'm trying to figure things out. That's good, I replied, keeping my voice steady. You should. I hope you'll be okay, she said, her voice breaking a little. I will, I answered with certainty. And you should focus on being okay too. There was a short pause, then she said, Goodbye, Liam. Goodbye, Emily, I said and ended the call before she could add anything else. That evening, I found myself on the back porch, a cold beer resting in my hand as my gaze drifted toward the night sky. The ache inside hadn't vanished, but it no longer pierced me like before. It had softened into something bearable, something I could manage and eventually move beyond. Emily's betrayal had ended our marriage, leaving behind a trail of broken trust. Yet, it hadn't destroyed me. Despite the devastation caused by her secret relationship, I had uncovered something surprising amidst the wreckage, a possibility for renewal. Maybe, years down the line, I would look back at this night and recognize it as the moment that set everything in motion, the instant my life began to shift. But tonight, that didn't matter. Tonight, I allowed myself to breathe deeply, drawing in the cool night air, feeling a calm sense of clarity. I sat there quietly, not dwelling on the past, but thinking about what lay ahead. A future without Emily, a future I could shape on my own terms.